speaking about the full preterist error, that newness of life and walking and rising into resurrection life was not available before AD 70, and showing how that the body is not a covenantal body of believers, but is speaking about the flesh and blood body that we human beings all possess. Let's start with the fact that the body is speaking of a human body in the context of the chapters in Romans. Romans chapter 6, verse 12. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lust thereof. The body spoken here is not a mortal old covenant body, but it's a mortal human being body. And it's not saying that you could not enter into the body of the church before AD 70, but that the human being body of flesh and blood has lusts housed within itself. That's true until this day. AD 70 didn't change that. Our flesh houses lusts. This chapter is involved in the issue later on, but Galatians 5 also reads as follows. Galatians 5 and 16. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. Notice he's speaking about walking after the Spirit. Romans chapter 8 speaks about walking after the Spirit in context of the body of death that Paul prayed to be delivered from. But here in Galatians 5, the same issue is associated with the lusts of the flesh. And I claim that the cravings and the desirings to do evil that Paul described in Romans 7 were dealing with the lusts of the flesh, just like Galatians 5. And that's the body Romans 7 was talking about when it said, who shall deliver me from this body of death? He wasn't talking about being delivered from an old covenant body, as though you could contrast the body of Moses from the body of Christ by speaking in terms of the covenants. He was talking about his plain old human flesh. Romans 7 relates to us Paul's past failures that he experienced before he wrote Romans 7. And I emphasize past here. Romans 6 relates to us the truths Paul learned through his experiences related in Romans 7. I'm going to get more into this later, but Romans 7 picks the thought up of the mortal body and says that sin indwells the mortal body. Romans 7 and 17. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh. He's not talking about a covenant body here. He's talking about his own personal flesh. And I'm sure full preterists all agree. In my flesh dwelleth no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. Notice he speaks of his flesh. That's not speaking of a covenant issue. Paul claims that he is speaking of his human flesh in saying sin indwelt him in verse 17. In his human flesh there was a force that resisted the fulfillment of the things that he willed to do in his mind. Paul specifically told us in plain language that he spoke of his flesh. And we are to apply that to the references of the body throughout this chapter. Paul expressed how that there was a pull in his human flesh that succeeded in causing him to commit sins instead of obeying God's laws that his mind desired to do. Now, mention of the law here will entice full preterists to claim that this indicates what the body refers to in the chapter, the old covenant body. However, that's not the case. Paul clearly designated that his flesh was the subject, and that's the culprit that housed no good thing, and that is the element from which he wanted to be delivered. Verse 18, for I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. The entire chapter teaches us how Paul learned the hard way of how to successfully overcome sin. He did indeed refer to the law, since it was the knowledge of what is good and what is evil laid out by God himself. But similarly, people might not even resort to old covenant law in order to live for God righteously today, but yet repeat the same error when they take the New Testament and turning it into a list of do's and don'ts and trying to make themselves follow that instead of walking after the Spirit, which is a term we're going to realize means depending on the power of the Spirit of God inside us as believers. That's walking after the Spirit. Walking after the flesh is relying on our human abilities and using willpower alone, not relying and resorting to God at all, but using our flesh alone to serve God. And so, walking after the Spirit is not something nobody could experience before AD 70. Romans 7 is so misunderstood. Full preterists are taking a similar stance as that of many other believers who are not full preterists when it comes to this issue. They feel Paul was unable to succeed in serving God in his day, the way he wanted to serve God. They claim he wrote of an ever-occurring struggle of wanting to do good, but not being able to do it. Yes, Paul did make that statement as follows, but it's misunderstood. Romans 7:14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. And in Romans 7:19, for the good that I would, I do not. But the evil which I would not, that I do. The things I want to do, the things that I have in my mind that I want to do and serve God, I'm not doing it, Paul said. I'm doing evil things instead. He was in no wise saying that this was an ever-occurring struggle that he never learned to overcome. Paul indicated that he came to a deliverance from this struggle, as we shall see. Paul did indeed walk after the Spirit before AD 70 and was merely relating to us the struggle of his past before learning of the correct manner in which to serve God. The reason he spoke as though he were struggling in the present tense is simply due to a manner of writing. It's a style of writing. He is walking us through the experiences he had as though we were there and he was there at the time in order to help us come to the same conclusions to which he came about as to why people fail and how they can cease failing. Using the present tense will enable us to more fully relate to his lesson, and that's what he's doing here. For example, it's like saying, here is how you get to Houston. Let's say I'm on Highway 59. I head towards the northeast. I am driving at the speed limit of 70 miles per hour, and I come to a curve. At that curve, I will find myself going in a slightly different direction. We don't have to be actually on the highway in order to speak in this manner in explaining directions to someone. When Paul walked us through his experiences, he used that kind of rhetoric of present tense simply to make the failure he once knew more relatable to others as he's speaking to them. Having reiterated his experiences of the past, he gave some explanations for his failure. He noticed that every time he tried to do good, when I would do good, evil was present with him. He was the problem. He wasn't calling God on the scene. He was taking everything into his own hands. While in a state of his past and not knowing he died to sin and not knowing he could yield to God to empower him, he referred to the sad state of wanting to please God but being unable to do so. The present tense referred to his past state, and he put himself in that past state and spoke of it from that perspective of being there. Hence, it's a manner of speaking. After saying he tried to do good and evil was present with him, Paul later wrote these words in Philippians, proving to us that he wasn't writing of an ongoing struggle in Romans as though no one in that era could overcome it. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. Notice the difference between that statement and the one in Romans 7:15. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. Notice Romans 7 doesn't involve doing it through Christ, who strengthened him. This victory through Christ to enable him to do all things according to Philippians is the same answer to the whole dilemma that is given at the end of Romans chapter 7. Let's read it in Romans 7, and I'm going to read into chapter 8 from verse 21 of chapter 7.